Okay. This is being neg, a step-by-step guide with pictures. So this is not just for two ends, I guess. It's also for one ends. It's more directed towards two ends, but there's some, just like when you're in the round, what to do if you're at one end. So I didn't really know how to start this lecture, so I thought I'd just start from the beginning of a round and walk you through how Julian and I, or Ben and I, went through a round. And I think you'll kind of see, like, some of this stuff is really basic, and some of it's a little more complicated. But I think being neg, I think we've kind of, like, worked out into almost a basic structure and formula, where being a good two-end and being a good neg team is way more just about using your time effectively and knowing what to do during each part of the debate than it is about like being really smart or being really good at technical debate. So just bear with me if some of this stuff seems a little more basic at the beginning. So we start out the round with the pairing. It's released, and you see your opponents, and at first you might be a little scared. But what you do after you get your pairing is really important. So first, no wasted time. Lincoln Garrett once gave us a lecture just about how to prep before round, and like his biggest advice was just like, do not waste time. This is not a time to talk with your friends. If you can, do not go to the bathroom, and like just every single second is a second that you will not use in the round to waste prep. So like every minute you have pre-round is a minute out of your 8 minutes of prep. So like that shows you how important it is. First step, obviously, figure out the 1AC, check it online while you're walking to the round, and when you see your team, ask immediately. And then the second step, once you know what the 1AC is, figure out the 1NC. Both partners should be working on the 1NC. So what Julie and I will do, we'll figure out the 1AC, and then we'll figure out what we want on the 1NC, and then I'll be like, I'll make the case, you make the off case. Okay? Every single second, both of you should be doing work. So that's the divvy up responsibilities part of the argument. So deciding the 1NC. What is the goal of a good 1NC? It's to test the app from multiple angles. So like you can see on the right this picture. Like it's funny because there's like all these different spec arguments. But even if each of these were viable arguments, this wouldn't be a good 1NC because they all test the app from the same angle, specification. Which is why you want to test the app from different angles. So for example, like having two agent counterplans in a 1NC is redundant. Because if there's a courts app and you read an executive and Congress counterplan, they're going to read the same court's key argument against both counterplans. Instead, you want like an agent counterplan, like an ESR counterplan, and then you want like an advantage counterplan that tests immigration key arguments. Same goes for topicality and disads. Having 4 political process disads is not as valuable as having 1 politics disad, 1 immigration bad disad, 1 modeling disad, etc. So you want to be able to space out your off case like that. One thing Lincoln is really big on is that the 1NC, the most important thing about the 1NC is providing the ability to have different blocks. And what that means a lot of the time is having less case in the 1NC. And I think that's a really good piece of advice when formulating 1NCs. Because I think the focus should be on having more off case than less, especially on a topic like immigration where none of the disads or counterplans are that good, which is why having less case in the 1NC is fine, because if your strategy does involve more case presses later on in the debate, you can make that up in the 2NC. But I would rather sacrifice time in the 1NC than in the 2NC on case. So unless you have a specific strategy, what you actually put in the 1NC is just a question of what generics usually. Like, if you have a new strategy to break, and you know you have to break it that round, obviously put it in. But if not, most of the time, like 95% of 1NCs you make will just be putting in generics. And that's fine. Like, you should be able to beat teams on generics. That's what Julie and I go for like 95% of times, because more normally, unless it's like one of the best teams, you don't have a specific strat. So it's just like, do you know which generics to put in? And to do that, you need to look at what do the generics test about the 1AC. Do they test the impacts, like impact terms? Do they test the internal links? You want to variate on those questions as often as possible. Okay, so this is one of the most important slides, and I think one of the most important themes. People, and novices especially, like just don't know how to prep during round. And I think we hit a lot of teams that have no idea what they're doing and use their time so badly. So you've made the 1NC and the round has just started. The 1AC is getting up and has just started spreading. What, as a 2N, do you do? I don't think you should ever flow the 1AC. Like, if you're following along and writing down every tag, you have just wasted 8 minutes of prep. Seriously. What I do during the 1AC is, if I already understand the 1AC, what I do is I prep for 6 minutes, and then I dedicate 2 minutes to questions. You can do that at the beginning or the end. But that is 6 minutes you won't have to take for the 2NC. I put an asterisk by by this because this is one of the most important things, I think, is what to prep when you are not giving a speech next, or you're like kind of preparing for a future speech. The first thing you should do is case if you're a 2N, because you know that will be in the 2NC. Or like you know that will be in the block at least, because you need case defense, obviously. So what that means during the 1AC, what I do is I'll pull up the 1NC, I know what 1NC cards Julian is going to read, and I'll write out extensions, okay? And then I do that with overviews on counterplans and like topicality, and I'll also answer perms if I'm extending a counterplan, because I know there'll be perms. So by the time the 1AC finishes, hopefully I have all of the 2NC case done, and I'll have overviews and essentials that I know will be in the 2NC already finished. 1Ns, same goes for you. You're probably going to be making a 1NC for most of the 1AC, or checking it over at least. If not, and you have extra time, you should do the same thing as the 2NC. Do not flow the 1AC. That is a waste of time. You should be prepping the 1NR. You should start with the overview, because you know that's what's going to be in the 1NR. Obviously, you might not know what disad will be in there, but Julian, when he's finished the 1NC, is already looking towards the block. And that saves so much prep and allows you to make your block speeches so much better. Okay, 1AC cross-X. I think a lot of the time, people misunderstand the point of cross-X. I was once told that the point of cross-X is to use speech time. As in, it should save you, those 3 minutes you use during cross-X is 3 minutes out of the 2NC you've just saved. A lot of the time, I see teams getting up and just like pointing out mistakes in the 1AC evidence, like look how bad your internal links are. And then they don't go for the 2NR, or it's not even in the 1NC. That is a waste of time. You just wasted speech time. What you should do is set up your strategies. It needs to be based on what you know the 1NC will be. And what that means is, let's say you have a politics disad. You should be asking about you should know what process the app goes through. Like, you should know whether it's a courts app, obviously. And I think a lot of times what people do wrong in 1AC cross-X is they'll ask a question, and then the other team will just like respond with something, and then they'll move on. It's not so much that 1AC cross-X should be 30 different questions, but rather, after the 1AC finishes, you should have around 6 lines of questioning. Like one based on circumvention, one based on solvency, one based off the internal links. As in, you should have multiple sub-questions that you know you're going to keep going in on. Because if you just ask a bunch of different multiple questions, you're never really pressing on in one single issue, and that's really valuable when the debate gets really narrow by the end. Okay, so politics disad, let's say you know your strategy is going to be a politics disad. What you want to ask about is, what does the app do, right? You need to know what political process it goes through. You don't want them spiking out of the 2AC. So let's say they have a solvency advocate that has Congress in it. You want to be like, why is Congress key? That narrows them down. It also will give them, it will show you what their solvency deficits will be, so during the 1NC, you can start prepping those out. Let's say your angle is circumvention. You know that's going to be a big part of the debate. Like against Carrollton, we knew that it was going to be a big case debate. We knew we were going to be going for a disad at St. Mark's. So all of 1AC cross-X was focused on circumvention and pointing out how bad their internal link was, because I knew that those questions would be central to the debate. And that time is especially crucial to see what their responses will be. Yeah, so disad and case, I just talked about that. You need to focus more on case. For K, it's obviously different. If you know your strat's going to be a K, you want to be asking more about the knowledge behind the 1AC, what they think the relationship between debate and the political is. You can kind of see that the 1AC cross-X should be completely dependent on your strategy, not some random kind of jabbering after evidence. One thing that I think I do during cross-X that I found helpful is that I like short, pointed questions, like yes or no questions, more than like long questions that they can ask you to repeat and will take like 30 seconds by the time you've asked the question. As in, let's say you want circumvention, like you're going for the circumvention angle. You're like, the plan raises caps, right? Yes. So you lift restrictions only on 212? Yes. So you don't grant green cards? Yes. So how do you guarantee that Trump doesn't just reverse that? Like stuff like that, where short, pointy questions that forces them into a corner that leaves them no room to wiggle out of that. Stuff like that, I think, is very helpful to keep a rhythm, and that's, I think, really important. Is that you just go 1, 2, 3, because the ability for the 1A to just be vague is deadly if they are allowed to shift even more in the 2AC, which is why you need targeted questions, not like, can you explain your app? You need to be like, why does this solve X? What is your argument for Y? So that you already know almost what they will say, but it's more about explaining to the judge how their app is bad, or what your strategy will do. So yeah, one thing that I really hate is lines and evidence and asking about lines and evidence. I think people misuse this a lot, where they'll be like, can I have a line for that? And that's kind of where that meme comes in. where it's like, you'll be like, do you have a line that says that? You should only be asking that question if you are 100% sure they do not have a line that says that. Otherwise, it gives them 30 seconds to scroll through their doc and be like, let me see, and then scroll through some more, and then maybe quote a line. The only reason you would do that is if you know that doesn't exist in like a short card, and be like, where's your argument for US key? And they're like, it's in the green card. Like, do you have a line for that? And they'll be like, well, we can read one of the 2AC. That's the only time you should have that, because it shows to the judge they're missing an internal link. Otherwise, it just allows them to kind of explain their internal link more and quote evidence for the judge. Okay, responding to cross-ex while being neg. This is more, I guess, a tip on just cross-ex in general, but I think these tips are helpful. Here's kind of a video that I found helpful. I don't know if the sound will play.
What?
Okay, yeah, well.
Fortunately, we have a plan. Professor Brink?
Hi, good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Einstein! What's the plan?
Yeah.
Fortunately, we...
So what you need to do is stall during cross-ex. And what that means isn't kind of like delay on purpose so that the judge knows, but take down their questions strategically without the other team knowing about it or the judge knowing about it. I heard a story about a round one time where it was 1AC cross-ex and they were asking about the app's internal links and the political process under the app. And the 1A was just like, I don't know where this question is going. I'll take the speaker point loss, but I'm not going to answer your question. So you want to be able to do that without actually saying that. As in, you want to be able to redirect their questions in a much more subtle way, if that makes sense. So what this means is speak conversationally. I think a lot of the time I get really fast in cross-ex because I just gave a speech. But the faster you ask questions, the more questions they get to. Which is why you want to calm down after you give a speech, when they stand up, and just speak conversationally. After our round against Nobro, Kristen Lowe told Julian and I that we had a really calming effect in cross-ex. And that's just because we spoke slowly and clearly, like we were in a conversation. Not like we were giving a speech, but just like we wanted to communicate to the judge, as if we were explaining an idea to them. And that slows down, it makes the other debater, if they're trying to rush you, it makes them look worse, it makes them look unorganized, and it makes you look calm and cool and collected. And I think this is another valuable tip on cross-ex, is you want to redirect the question where you want the debate to be. And what that means is, let's say there's a complicated counterplan that you just read in the 1C, and they're asking about the counterplan. You want to redirect the question to be able to explain the counterplan to the judge. As in, you want to be controlling what you tell during cross-ex. The same way that I told you that during 1AC cross-ex, you want to be able to kind of elucidate your strategy, the other thing is true for the other side. That when you're getting cross-ex, you should use that time to explain your strategy more. As in, you should never let the opponent dictate what the question is over solely. So an example of this is if somebody asks you, like this is just a basic example, you stand up for 1AC cross-ex, they're like, or 1NC cross-ex, you're like, who does the counterplan? What branch of the government? And you're just like, well, the resolution says USFG, and that's where we'll specify to. Like, you kind of refuse the original terms of their question because they said, who passes the plan? And you just answer, well, the resolution. You kind of redirected the original basis of the question. And that's a basic example of that. Let's say, like, does the counterplan solve the second advantage? If they're just asking for, like, a net benefit question. That gives you the ability to explain how the counterplan solves the second advantage. You see, you want to take openings in their question and exploit them to explain your strategy to the judge. Okay. I think this gets out of hand a little bit when people kind of overly use tactics that weren't strategic. So one thing that really makes me mad is when people, every single time they get a question, repeat the question. And it's like, maybe, I don't even know, people might not be doing that strategically, but you shouldn't be doing that. I think it looks bad, and you can use that time to think about the question, and I don't think that's a good strategy. Giving long winding answers as well isn't strategic. You can give short answers that help the judge, but if you try to stall, it's going to look bad. And you should answer their questions, but you should do so in a way that helps you as well. So I see a lot of times people getting mad in cross-ex where they're trying to escalate the situation. If you get cut off in a question, either one of two things is happening. One, the opponent and the judge the opponent has missed their opportunity to get their answer, which is good for you, right? If they're asking something important about the counterplan and they cut you off and they don't understand what the counterplan does, that is good for you because you'll explain it later, but they have no idea. However, I think the only reason you should be like, can I please finish my question, is if they're misconstruing what you're saying. So let's say somebody cuts you off and is like, okay, so the counterplan doesn't solve the second advantage. You're like, then you can be like, can I finish my question? Because obviously that's not true. And just look at the judge. And like, I think a very effective tactic that I think Mr. Clark told me one time is that if somebody cuts you off and they just won't let you speak, just shake your head and look at the judge and make eye contact. Because trying to talk over and yell over the other opponent will just make you look aggressive and angry. But like, the worst case scenario is the 2A gets up and is like, they conceded in cross-ex, the counterplan solves nothing. Then if you shook your head and like looked at the judge, you can just be like, obviously that's not what we were saying, they cut me off, I'll explain it now. But that makes you look mature, and it's better than trying to escalate the situation and be like, can I please finish my question? Just let them move on, and it's fine, and you'll get a chance to explain it in the next speech. Yeah, one thing I really don't like is, I see this a lot in novice debate, where people will ask the question, and every single time they get a question, they'll be like, let me find the author for that. It's fine if you don't have the author. If you have the author name, you can say that, but like, when somebody asks you a question, you don't need an author every time. That just wastes time, and like, I think it's inefficient. Okay, during the 2AC. So the 2AC has begun, they get up. What do you flow? So for the 2 ends out there, what I flow, and I don't know really like whether this is kosher, but I flow case, and then I just flow the stuff I'm taking in a block. That means that I trust my 2A a lot. Okay? Like to do that, you need to trust your 2A a lot. There's a big risk to that, because if your 2A doesn't understand that a disset has been straight turned, then you'll lose the round. Okay? But that's why I would normally look over the 2AC quickly. But honestly, let's say I flow case, and then I flow T and the counterplan. That's like maybe 3 minutes into the 2AC. That's 5 extra minutes of prep I take instead of flowing all the disads that I know join will kick out of. So like, yeah, there's a risk, because what if they straight turn the disad and join doesn't realize? But at the same time, that's 5 extra minutes of prep that I have. But just in case, I think if you do this strategy, I would check over everything. Just like scroll through before you give up your speech. Stand up to give your speech just to make sure they didn't straight turn anything. The 1NC, I make Julian flow the whole 2AC because I know he has 8 minutes to prep during the 2NC, so he doesn't need that efficiency that I need to prep. So that's helpful. Also, before the 2AC ends, usually Julian and I will discuss what we're taking in the block. You should do that before cross-ex, obviously, because, I don't know, like this doesn't happen a lot, but if there's some miscommunication about what you're taking in the block, and you spend all of cross-ex prepping something that Julian thought wasn't going to be in the block, then you wasted those 3 minutes, and it means that Julian didn't cross-ex on something that I'm taking or that he's taking. That's a simple thing, but it can save big mistakes. Okay, choosing and splitting the neg block. How to choose what's in the block. So, choosing what's in the block is about finding the best distance between the best position and the least covered position. And what that means is that if you have a really, really good argument, but the 2AC spends 4 minutes on it, then maybe you should extend that position. Let's say you have a really bad disad, like soft power bag or horse trading, and they spend 30 seconds on it. Well, it's going to look really, really attractive because they only have 2 arguments on it, but the reason they put 2 arguments on it is because it's a bad disad. So I honestly know what the block will be mostly before most rounds, and that's not great, and I think as you get into higher level debating, you're going to want to be more flexible, and that's something I still struggle with. But I think most of the time, if you've been, as I've said, I've been prepping at this point during the whole 1AC, 1NC, and 2AC, which means I have most of the 2NC already written out. Which, yeah, like if they really undercover something, I'll have the time to switch. But at the same time, I think you should have a comfortable position going into the debate what your best strategy is. Yeah, so that's what I just talked about. In an ideal scenario, you have no preconceptions about what the block will be before the 2AC. But that's not what always happens. And in most debates, I already know what the 2NC will be. So the most important thing about the block, I think, is preserving the ability for the 2 and R to go for multiple strategies. The same way that the 1NC, the point of the 1NC is to preserve the ability of the block to have multiple strategies. It's the same for the 2NC. So like Julian and I sometimes, the 2NC will be a counterplan, case, and a disad in the 1 and R. Like, that's a little sketchy because that only provides, that means the disad has to be in the 2 and R. That means I have 1 route to win. Like, yeah, I can take the counterplan, but still, if the 1AR spends 2 minutes on a disad, I'm kind of done for. Which is why having something like T in the 2NC, counterplan T case, is a great way to like balance against that, or another disad, like a short disad like base, you can extend quickly, because that provides you the flexibility so that the 1 and R can't just hammer down on something. And the reason you want to have multiple strategies is to make the 1AR's life as hard as possible. How to split the block, I don't have great advice for this, but like normally do what pretty much everybody does. 2NC will be counterplan T case, 1NR disad, or 2NC will be counterplan short disad case. It gets more complicated when you have impact terms or critique. Usually we do 2NC K, and then 1NR will be case or case and T. We don't usually go for that T argument, but that, I think, skews the 1NR really well. Okay, I think this is one of the most important slides because the way a good block should go down, I think that if you understand how to formulate block responses, any of you can give as good a 2NC as I can. So the 2AC, no, seriously, like maybe like there'll be slight differences, but the 2AC has started. Hopefully you've already finished case overviews and perms, right? So if during the 2AC, all you have to do is the line by line on specific arguments, like parole, topicality, and case. Let's say that's the 2NC. So what you're trying to do is make the 1AR as hard as possible, right? So with that goal in mind, how should you answer on line by line? First is Mr. Clark's original advice to me, subpointing. I think that is a great thing that I know many of y'all do, but just to repeat, you want to have multiple arguments on 2AC arguments because it's incredibly hard for a 1A to extend an argument that has 4 subpoints. That makes their life so much harder because then they have to answer 4 things instead of just one argument you gave. So let's say parole, right? You're prepping parole, they say uncertainty. Having like 6 arguments that all are even if statements makes it so much harder for the 1AR to even consider uncertainty as a viable deficit. Second is indict evidence. I think this is like something Joanne and I do that is really underutilized, and not because like it's hard, but because people just don't think it's like very strategic. I don't think most cards, except maybe some 1AC cards, say what like people cut them to say. As in, like a lot of cards will kind of support their tag, but they'll have a lot of flaws, like reverse causality, alternative causes. And I think that makes it, especially for the 1NR, so hard for the 1AR. If you are answering every 2AC card with multiple arguments and then indicting their evidence, the 1AR has to probably read a new card if the 2AC card was as bad as you say it is. And even if it's not, that means the 1AR has to then back up their evidence, which is incredibly hard too, because it means they have to scroll back. Okay, so for the 2NC, so like, I know this is kind of weird to understand, but every 2NC goes down like this for me, right? The 2AC, let's say they've gone case, T, counterclaim. So case, T, let's say it's T, humanitarian, and the parole counterclaim. I have then stopped flowing, okay? I have then prepping. The first thing I do is case. I already have case written out, the extensions of impact defense, the extensions of internal link defense, right? But obviously the 2AC has answered the 1NC cards. So what I do then is I'll answer their spin. Let's say I read a 1NC piece of evidence that's like economic decline doesn't lead to war. The 2AC is like, well, that doesn't assume status quo conflict with China. That is a revisionist power. Then on my flow, I'll write, like our evidence does assume China interdependence means it would collapse their economy as well. Okay? So what I do in the 2NC then is I'll read no impact to economic decline. Then I say the 2AC said X, but that's wrong because of Y. Do you understand that? Because then that case, it's pretty much done almost to a formula where I have an extension, I answer the 2AC spin, and then maybe I'll read another card. Okay? So after I prep that out, let's say there's like 2 minutes left or 3 minutes left in the 2AC, right? Then let's say I'm taking T. I'll copy the T blocks in, and all of y'all can obviously do that, right? Because for T, it's very block heavy, and you can just copy that in, obviously. Most of the time, you won't need kind of like other blocks, and if you do, you should just be using your evidence from the 1NC. And then the counterplan is obviously the hardest part, copying those blocks in, and then a lot of the time, like for parole, we have blocks to every 2AC argument. Which is why, see, after this 2NC, all of y'all could give almost the exact 2NC I could give. Maybe the only difference would be in case, like, that is a skill that is acquired over time, like indicting their responses to impact defense. And on parole, sure, they might have some arguments that you won't have answers to, but that's where evidence indictment comes in and knowing your strategies well. And that's not really something you can just teach, but that's something that comes over time with recognizing how kind of their evidence doesn't fit their strategy and how their evidence interacts with your strategy. But as you can see, like maybe there might be some slight discrepancies, but with this strategy, like you won't need much 2NC prep, and the prep you do take will be so helpful because it will be so in-depth at the level of you're indicting every single 2AC answer and subpointing everything because you've used 1AC prep, 1NC, 2 prep, and 1NC cross-ex. All of that time is like 20 minutes of prep for just an 8-minute speech. So it should be pretty good. For the 1NR, most of this applies. Obviously, you have the 2 and C to prep. The biggest advice for the 1NR is, one, it's all about cards. Even though if you look at Juju's doc, sometimes it might not seem like that. But the reason for that is because, like, the reason that having a lot of cards is helpful is because it overloads the 1NR. And that's the point of the 1NR, I think, is the 2 and C is finished, right? The 1NR, once you read a lot of cards, it puts more pressure on the 1AR, obviously because they have less time to react. But the way Juju does that is not always in cards, but in like multiple responses. And Juju is super good at indicting evidence and saying why this evidence doesn't matter. Which is why, like, even if you're not reading cards, the point is to provide as many arguments that it's almost impossible for the 1AR to extend multiple arguments on a dissent, because the 1AR has spent so long on every single issue. Because think about it, if you have 8 minutes with the 2 and C, your answers, you should be re-highlighting evidence. You should be quoting their evidence because you have that time to do so. Okay, prepping for the 2 and R. So the 1AR, let's say the 1NR has just ended. Okay, Juju has just sat down. What do? Use Google Docs. Use Google Docs. I'll say that again. Like, if you can take away one thing from this lecture, use Google Docs. It is OP. Like, it is so OP. What Juju does, Juju will sit down from the 1NR, and immediately I'm like, Juju, can you type out the overview or like line on this issue on the dissent? Like, can you type out uniqueness on the dissent? And then I'll type out something on the counterplan or case. Same advice goes for 2 and C prep. You want to divvy up responsibilities and start with necessities. So Julian sits down. Let's say I think I'm going to go for parole and the dissent, the politics dissent that Juju took in the 1NR. I know in the 2NR I'm going to need an overview on the dissent, I'm going to need perm answers, and I'm going to need uncertainty answers. And I'm going to need case, obviously. So I should start with those things. Because keep in mind, this is before the 1AR has gotten up. So I don't know what the 1AR will extend, but obviously they're probably going to have to extend that stuff. So what Juju and I will do is, I'll be like, Juju, can you type out uniqueness and no link? Because I think that's what they'll do. And then I'll start typing out case defense or maybe uncertainty on parole. Usually I would do case first because unless it's a parole counterplan that I know solves the entirety of case, I know case will be in the 2NR, but I might pick the counterplan. And again, this is just saving time. This is cutting off deficit, like cutting off time that I think a lot of people misuse. Same with subpointing. For the 2NR, if you are both typing out something, you should have the time to do so. So here's some examples of our Google Docs. And like you can see how we subpoint. We have the ability to do so because we use all of our prep so efficiently that we have the ability to do things like if you look down at the bottom, Juju types out all of this subpointing that is so helpful because he has all of like the pre-prep 1AR and then after the 1AR to just focus on that line by line. So he makes it super good. Here's another example of like link debates and uniqueness debates and how they should be formatted. Juju has the ability to do this because, again, he's just focusing on that for like 8 minutes, like cumulative time prepping a dissad with like 2 arguments from the 1AR. So he has the ability to make it super in-depth, to do things like F comparison. And that's all about shaving off seconds that can be used to win the debate. Okay, so actually giving the 2NR. The 1AR sets down, you prep, you stand up, what do? You need to pick and choose. That's just something that I still struggle with, and it changes, right? It's one of the hardest skills for the 2NR, because you need to know what the 2NR will do. So I think a good example of this is case, right? Extending every single 2 and C case argument is a terrible idea. And I see novices do this all the time. And like even people we hit like later in the tournament will try to get in every single case argument they extend into 2 and C. That is not a good idea. You should adjust what you're doing on case, what tricks you're extending on parole, based off how the 1AR mishandles them, right? But remember, by the time, that should be 2NR, by the time the 1AR finishes. So by the time the 1AR finishes, you can have all the overviews done, hopefully most of case done, and answers to their biggest arguments. Which means the only thing you really have to do is answer the 1AR tweaks, right? And respond to how the 1AR spins arguments. So let's say before the 1AR gets up, Julian was typing out the dissad, and I'm typing out uncertainty on parole. What that means is that once the 1AR finishes, I already have AT uncertainty on a Google Doc, or maybe on my flow if you want to write it out. But what that means is the 1AR probably tried to re-explain some things and shift some arguments, right? So you can add some lines, but for the most part, you should already be done with that. And that's like another example of how the prep you can do can make you so much more efficient later on. So 2NR strategy. Somebody once told me that the 2NR is not answering the 1AR, it's answering the 2AR. And I think that's partially true, but obviously you have to take into account that what the 2AR is will reflect how you mishandle stuff in the 2NR. So what this means is you need to balance between answering 1AR arguments and predicting the 2AR, right? So what that means is if you know that they're extending an argument that isn't reflected in their evidence on the disad, like they are extending uniqueness but they have no evidence for it, you can spend less time there because you know they won't be able to stake the debate on that. That's kind of a basic example, but an example of that is, let's say, on the parole counterclaim. You know that against Woodward, they have to go for uncertainty because things like benefits are like made-up solvency deficits. You should feel comfortable spending a lot of time there. And you need to make it clear to the judge that the reason you're spending a lot of time there is because the 2AR will go for that. Yeah, so another thing is discussing this with your partner. I think Julian is really helpful with this, is that when we're going for a strategy, we will discuss what we think the 1AR will pivot to and what the 2AR will pivot to. A great example of this is 2NC cross-sects. You should look for what they're cross-sexing you about, because that will tip their hand over what they think their best arguments are. For example, when we're asked, Juju every time against T. Tassoff or against T. Humanitarian spends like 2 minutes cross-sexing on predictability. The reason is because that's our best argument. And if you take kind of note of what they are cross-sexing you on, you will know what they want to go for. Because think about it, that's the 2A cross-sexing you on what they think their best strategy is. So if you like kind of write that down or just remember it, then during 2NR prep, you can think about what you think the 2AR will go for. So for the 2NR is less of a storytelling speech than the 2AR. One thing Julian does great in the 2AR is tell a story, right? But you don't have that ability or that privilege to really do that in the 2NR because you're so spread out and you have to predict the 2AR. That does not mean that you should not be having kind of ethos moments or overall picture telling or like storytelling moments. I think the best way to do that is not in as much the overviews of like counterclaims or disads, but in line bombing. So there's some phrases that I use regularly that I think are helpful to tell the story on the line bombing. So one example of this is they'll win X, but Will Morgan told me this, and he tells all the KLab debaters that you should acknowledge your weaknesses. Like on the parole counterclaim, you can be like, yes, they'll win, that some uncertainty will occur in the world of the counterclaim, but like that's inevitable, or but like comparatively, the disad link turns that solvency deficit. As in, you should concede, or like not concede arguments, but you should be willing to understand that they will win arguments. And you should be mature about that. Like, yes, they'll win this, or yes, their evidence is good here, but, and that kind of shows a next level of debating that takes into account their best argument, but then shoves it down and shows why you're still ahead despite that. Another phrase that I think is good for illustrating this is their best argument, but, as in something, this like on the uncertainty deficit, or on uniqueness on the disad, you want to be like, the 2AR will go for this argument. And that is a great kind of showing to the judge that you know what's going to happen, but you'll still beat it, right? So like on uncertainty, this is their best argument on the counterclaim, but they've dropped 3 arguments here. Like that ability to tell a story that isn't summed up in the overview, but impacts each argument on the line by line is so helpful for the judge when constructing the RFD post-round. Another phrase is, the 2AR will sound good here, but every time they say X, remember Y. This is really good, especially against soft left app, that are really based off kind of like ethical signaling, like Julian talking about one time he said in the 2AR, remember the children, and like, yeah, like that's funny, but like a lot of the time judges aren't robots, and like they do respond to affective signaling. So on their best argument, if you know that 2AR is going to start with everything, you want to plant the seeds of doubt in the judge's mind. So like Mona is great from Woodward about uncertainty on the counterclaim. She talks about, like the fear of deportation every day. You want to be like, Mona will rant about the fear of deportation, but every time she says that, remember that that's inevitable in the world of the act too. And then when the judge is flowing the 2AR, if you've connected with the judge in that moment, you've made eye contact, when Mona says the fear of deportation, the judge will remember, wait, but the 2AR had a good answer to that. And that's really what you want. You want the 2AR, when they're giving that 2AR, the judge to be thinking about your 2AR. Something that I got from Atticus that I think is really funny is, this sounds like a good argument, but. He did this against North Broward one round, where against Psycho, I think it was NDCA round 5 last year. In the 2NR, to answer their best argument, he was like, this sounds like a good argument, but. Like obviously, you shouldn't put that on their best argument, but that's a great way to cut through the BS and to show the judge that like, this is not what their argument actually is. And like, these phrases are obviously just a short list, and these are just examples to show you that on every single argument, you should be telling how it impacts the debate. As in, let's say on case, you want internal link defense when you're going for a counterclaim. You want to be like, this lowers the comparative solvency the counterplan needs because we've won that the app also has solvency problems. That ability to do like one sentence that shows why that argument is important, if you're doing that throughout the whole 2NR, it doesn't use a lot of time, but if you're doing that on every single argument, that means that after the 2NR, you'll have a bunch of even-if statements, a bunch of comparative deficits that is so hard for the 2AR to answer that it's really hard for them to come back. So if you look at that meme on the side, you see that dropping impacts in the 2NR, there is no 3NR. I don't think you should say there is no 3NR, because that's kind of cliche, but I do think it's incredibly important in every single 2NR to preempt the 2AR new arguments. One thing that Juju is really good at is just like making stuff up in the 2AR when I drop stuff. And so what Blanc was really good at that too, right? And judges would vote on that stuff all the time because he'd be like, well, on the other flow we said X, so this relates to Y. And like if I dropped an argument, we can just like win a debate because Julian will make something up and sound like convincing about that. If you think they're going to do that on an issue, you need to say something or you will lose the debate on it. You should not trust the judge to kind of hold the line. You should never trust the judge on this. You want to be like, the 1AR was too short here, hold the line. There's an HS Impact Policy podcast where Scotty P had a phrase that was like, I don't think you should say this, but it's kind of a good illustrative example. It's like, the line for new 2AR arguments is not whether they're completely new, but whether your explanation of the argument changed dramatically. Does that make sense? It's not that an argument is completely new in the 2AR, but it's that your understanding of it changed. Because that means that I couldn't have predicted it. Now, Scotty P said to say that in every 2NR. I don't think you have to say that, but that's kind of an illustrative example of like, even if you're kind of not sure if they will make up arguments, they will re-explain arguments to get out of the 2NR. So you want to be like, hold them to the 1AR explanation on X. If you know that they will go for something, like I said, you want to be doing this on the most important issue. So one thing that I think is important is in evidence indictment. Do we have time for this, Austin? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to send out a piece of evidence to y'all, or a packet of evidence with evidence, and I just want to go through it and kind of show the process of indicting evidence, because I think that's kind of one of the most important things for DEGs. Sorry, I should have attached this. Okay. So yeah, pull that up. Okay, so like I said, I think one of the most important parts of kind of debate, and I guess being neg, I just thought I'd put this in here because I think it's really helpful in high-level debates and new debates where like people break new arguments, is the skill of being able to just read through a piece of evidence in like 10 seconds and explain why it's bad. That is such a good skill. So like, if somebody breaks a new app, you need to have the ability to read through a piece of evidence and be able to explain why it's bad. Like, and same for like a 2NC. Let's say they read a new solvency deficit against the counterplan, right? And you don't have blocks for it. You need to be able to dissect that piece of evidence, and that's a skill that I think Greenhill is insanely good at. Like Chris Eckert, the thing that makes him good is not that he's incredibly technical or that he's really ethosy. He has those things, but he's so good at cutting through the BS. And that's why it's scary to debate him, because MBA's evidence sometimes isn't the best, right? We do rely on some, sketchy highlighting, some sketchy cuttings, but the ability for teams to kind of cut through that, not because of you, Austin. Your evidence is good, but like obviously a lot of the stuff we have, like indefinite parole, like our main strategy is kind of made up, right? So the ability to just call BS is incredibly important. So we're going to start with some GBN evidence. So this is from a GBN 1NC that talks about immigration fraud, right? And they have this card that's about why immigration fraud funds transnational crime networks, right? So scrolling through this card, it's talking about identity management. Okay, that's probably related to immigration. It's decentralized nodes, attempts to dismantle. So like you can see, this card is about fraud. None of this is really about immigration fraud, but more about documents overall. Then it says document fraud is in particular provides funding while simultaneously fulfilling a vital logistical need. So two things here. First is that obviously this card is about document fraud overall. The card below does talk about immigration, but you want to be able to explain how different parts of the card are bad in different kind of aspects. Second is reverse causality. Like, do y'all know what reverse causality is? So it's like, in this, for example, this card says that immigration fraud gives funds to like terrorists, right? But it does not say that taking away those funds would collapse the terrorist organizations. Does that make sense? So a lot of our old 1ACs had this mistake where we would be like, HIAs help buildings. And then we would be like, well, we didn't have any evidence that said without HIAs the buildings would collapse, right? We found that later on, at the Henry tournament. But that ability, that threshold for evidence, you should be asking every single time. As in, just because they have a card that says X leads to Y, does the absence of X lead to something else, right? And this card obviously doesn't say that. It says that document fraud helps terrorist groups, but it does not say that without that funding, terrorist groups would collapse. Also, this whole scenario is about, even if we can agree that this evidence says that fraud leads to kind of funding for terrorist networks, where's the US keyword? Actually, this is GBM's 1AC, and they have no evidence that says that the immigration fraud that comes from the US is the main source of funding for these terrorist groups. That almost takes out that scenario. Because unless they have evidence, in the middle part of the card, in the underlined part, talks about Chinese document fraud. Which is why, these questions that are, kind of just logical questions, and kind of just, logical thinking through of scenarios, alternate causes, why can't people just, these terrorist groups just go to another country and increase document fraud in those countries post-act? And why does that not solve for their funding? Even if they got rid of every single dollar from document fraud in the US, there are still billions of dollars from Chinese document fraud, from European fraud in the EU, right? So those logical questions, I think the ability to ask that is incredibly important. If you scroll down to scenario 3, let's go through some of the worst evidence in debate, parole answers, because none of them are real. So first, the counterplan links causes congressional backlash and action. They recut my card. It's kind of insulting. And they said that this is a reason the counterplan links. This card is Congress in the past has backlash to parole, right? In 1980 with the Refugee Act. Does anybody know why that's not really a great warrant for why the counterplan links to politics?
It's backlash at the president, not at other members of Congress.
Yes, that's great, right? It doesn't trigger his bipolar. Another warrant is this is describing one time that Congress rewrote the law. This is the only time in history where Congress rewrote the parole law. So Obama's 6 parole programs, right? Why Congress didn't backlash to any of those besides maybe one angry Congress member. And that ability to just point out why this card doesn't apply, you just eviscerated this card. Uncertainty. So this card is about constant government surveillance, deportation, and traps in the US. Thanks, Jack. So this card, does anybody know why this card is not applicable?
It's about TPS, not parole.
Yes, right? So this card is describing surveillance that uniquely occurs under the TPS program. The reason that surveillance occurs is because TPS, they'll be deported eventually, so under that program there are laws that say that those people have to be surveilled so that they can't just stay here illegally after the program ends, right? But this program is explicitly describing those surveillance mechanisms and is not about parole, it's explicitly about temporary programs. Same goes for this, the Papa Dimitri evidence. This is not the great cutting of that card. That cutting is actually pretty good. But this one is about investment in businesses and says that there's a disincentive to invest because people think that they will leave, right? Well, we have indefinite parole. It's not temporary. This just begs the question of whether immigrants perceive the counterplan as temporary or not, right? Because this card is explicitly describing temporary programs. So this is about temporary missions again. You kind of get the point. Here's another card. LPRs keeps the economy. Does anybody want to take a jab at this card?
It just says that naturalization has increased growth or increased employment. It doesn't say why that's key to the economy. Why without LPR the economy would collapse.
Yes, exactly. So 2 things. First is even increased earnings, why is that key to the economy? But secondly, what is the warrant for why naturalization helps wages, right? There is no warrant in that there's no warrant in that at all. So there's no reason that wouldn't apply to parole as well. You can see we can kind of strategically dismantle this 2AC without cards, without even having any cards, because by pointing out how bad their evidence is. Can apply for work performance, obviously the EAD blank if you have that, rip that one around from BG. Then only Congress defines family. This card is another really bad card that just in the law, Congress has defined family, but that doesn't mean that you can't parole people and provide a definition for that parole program. We can almost answer this whole 2AC without cards because of how trash this 2AC is. This is obviously kind of hyperbolic, and better teams will have better 2ACs, but I think this applies across the spectrum, and I think people don't indict evidence or kind of hold the evidence at face value way too much. That's all I got.
All right, Aiden, do you want to take some questions?
Yeah, somebody has.
Alright, so like this first card that you had, like scenario 1, it's like, you got PDF and it's massive. How are you able to, like, in around, like, able to like go through and dissect why this card's
Yeah, so
Aiden, can you also repeat the question short?
yeah, so Ashwin was asking like if there's a really long card, how do you have the time to indict the evidence? So a few things. First is that you're not going to be going over every single 1AC card, right? The only scenario in which you would want to do that is if you think the 2NR is going to be a disset, right? This is more for 2AC cards, which will be shorter, but it obviously, like, the answer basically is just like, it comes with practice. You need to be able to scan a card. I guess the first thing I would say is just scan the highlighting at first to see like what the argument is making. Like, I don't have time to read ununderlined portions. Most of the time I don't read that stuff, unless I can't find a problem with the card elsewhere. But I really think that most of the time you don't need to read the ununderlined parts of a card to figure out problems with it. Like, we can tell by just reading this stuff that it's not only about the US, which takes out their advantage by itself, right? Like, yeah, these cards are wrong, but like, I don't have a super short mechanism besides just like, one, it comes with practice, and two, if you don't have a lot of time, for the 2 and C, just scan the highlighting and think of logical arguments against that. Right?
For the 1NR then, do you think it's worth blowing up the tiny portions of the card and reading
Yeah.
through them?
I think I would do that last if you have extra time.
Okay.
Is really my advice there. If you think that I would do that like immediately, maybe if you think that the card is like too good to be true or a little sketchy. But like a lot of the time there might not be like a hidden gem in the underlined part. But if you have time, like there's no reason not to, and like that gives you huge speaker point bonuses if you're like, I'll insert a rehighlighting of their card, and then they have to read a new card if it really is killer, you know? Thanks, y'all.